Brought to you by Chevrolet, an American Revolution. Up next, see the all-new 6th-generation Corvette take on one of Europe's most challenging courses, the Nürburgring.
The Nürburgring is unlike any other racetrack in the world. It's unique. It's like a wide open country road that you just run as fast as you can.
And now, enjoy the show.
In the final days of the Civil War, Confederate President Jefferson Davis made a desperate attempt to escape the federal armies that pursued him. Hoping to fight on, he took along the last of the Southern treasury, $750,000. Davis would see the death of this dream of a Confederacy and go to prison a penniless man. But what of the Confederate treasure?
I know absolutely that I can put all the pieces together. It may not be today, it may not be next week or even next year, but I will solve the mystery. I will find it.
Others are not so sure. Is this treasure just a legend? Or does a small Georgia town hold the secrets of the lost Confederate gold? "50 miles northwest of Augusta, amid pastures and lush pine forests, is a likable small southern town named Washington, Georgia. Live oaks shade its quiet neighborhoods. Much of the town's life still revolves around the famous Courthouse Square. Most streets boast at least one stately antebellum house. The people are friendly. Life is lived at an easy pace. It's not unlike many other small towns in the South, except for one fact. In 1865, Washington, Georgia was the last stop on the final journey of the Confederate government, and it remains at the center of one of America's greatest treasure sagas. Depending on who's telling the story, somewhere around this town lies anywhere from a few coins to tens of thousands of dollars of buried treasure. For this place is home to the legend of the lost Confederate gold.
When people think about Washington, first thing they think of is the lost gold of the Confederacy.
We have lots of stories, about the Confederate gold.
I never heard of anybody finding any, but they're still looking for it.
I like to believe the gold's still around here somewhere.
Let me put the tanks in and then we'll start loading other gear in.
If there is gold around, no one has a better chance of finding it than this man. Lee Spence found his first shipwreck when he was 12 and went on to become one of the most successful marine treasure hunters in the world. But for the past few years, Lee has been driven to find only one treasure. Now he thinks he knows where it is. In a few hours, he'll discover if he's solved the puzzle.
My family was from the South, from the old South, and so I heard the stories of the Confederate gold and the other treasures. All of this was part of my childhood, and it was a natural thing getting into it. I guess the reason I like the idea of the Confederate gold is that it is part of my heritage. It is something that is the heritage of all of the people in the South.
What are the historic riches that have created a legend around a small Georgia town and fueled the dreams of a relentless treasure hunter? The story of the fabled Confederate treasure has its beginnings in the end of the Great Southern Cause. In the spring of 1865, Robert E. Lee's weary army languished in the trenches in front of Petersburg, Virginia, as Ulysses Grant tightened his death grip. On April 1st, the Union forces smashed through the lines, and the once proud gray troops fell back in helpless final retreat. Early the following day, Confederate President Jefferson Davis received the telegram he had been dreading.
I see no prospect of doing more than holding my position here till night. I am not certain that I can do that. I advise that all preparations be made for leaving Richmond tonight. General Robert E. Lee, April 2nd, 1865.
Davis was attending church that spring Sunday morning when he received Lee's final warning. He immediately set in motion plans for the government's evacuation of Richmond.
You have to understand Jefferson Davis was the kind of man who looked on the bright side constantly. He never, even during the course of the coming retreat, never wanted to admit that all was lost.
By the evening, Davis and much of his cabinet met at a Richmond train station. They would flee the advancing Yankees and relocate the Confederate capital to the small Virginia town of Danville, where they hoped Lee could regroup and continue the war. A decrepit engine sat with steam up, waiting as boxes of Confederate records and files were frantically loaded and officials got aboard. On a separate track, another train was hurriedly loaded with a different, even more precious cargo, the Confederate treasury. Uniformed men hurriedly transferred 8 wagon loads of treasure to the waiting train. Much of this treasure was in 200,000 Mexican silver pesos. Over 8,000 pounds of these coins were stored in 50 wooden kegs. U.S. $20 golden double eagles were packed in coin boxes, $25,000 to the box.
The remaining $60-odd thousand consisted of a wild melange of a few foreign coins, some British gold sovereigns, and masses of 5-cent, 10-cent, 25-cent, and 50-cent silver coins. Also very bulky, cumbersome, and inconvenient.
In addition to coins, there were stacks of gold ingots, bags of gold nuggets, and silver bricks. There was 16,000 English pounds sterling and a chest of jewels and silver donated to the war cause by Southern women. How much was all of this worth?
I'm not sure anybody knew exactly to the penny how much money was there. But the real money, the gold and silver coin and the bullion, has been estimated anywhere from 300,000 plus up to 500,000.
As word of the impending loss of the capital spread, the Richmond banks frantically looked for a way to save their gold deposits.
There were 6 banks in Richmond, and the directors of the banks got wind of what was going on, so they asked Mr. Davis if they could put their monies on the same train and get them out to safety also.
Davis approved, and as much as $450,000 in gold was loaded. This bank gold was separately guarded and would be kept strictly apart from the rest of the precious cargo. After hours of waiting, the 2 trains finally pulled out of Richmond as flames of looting and destruction consumed the Confederate capital. One train held Jefferson Davis, 6 members of his cabinet, and various other staff and families. The other train carried the combined treasure on which rested the fading hopes of the Confederacy. The trains slowly moved south and finally arrived at Danville the following afternoon. For 1 week, Davis went through the motions of running what remained of the government in the hope that General Lee would pull off another of his miracles. But word soon arrived that there would be no more miracles. Surrounded by overwhelming forces even he could not challenge, Lee had surrendered.
Davis got word, of course, of Robert E. Lee's surrender, April 9th, 1865. And he decided that, of course, he had to leave Danville. He couldn't stay in Virginia without Lee's army. So they packed up and moved on to Greensboro.
Jefferson Davis now convinced himself that he could move to North Carolina and somehow unite behind the tattered army of Joseph E. Johnston, who was retreating from Union General Sherman. If this would fail, Davis would continue to retreat across the Mississippi, where he would join the Confederate troops in Texas to carry on the cause of the South. The treasure would also keep moving. It was sent on ahead to Greensboro, where it would soon move again, this time by wagon. But not all of the treasure would continue the flight. The 50 kegs of Mexican silver were worth almost $200,000, but weighed over 4 tons. Since the railroad would soon be unavailable, the silver wasn't worth the great trouble of carrying it.
Secretary of the Treasury, Trenholm, who by this time was becoming increasingly ill, ordered 2 men to go out and make this Mexican silver disappear, hide it somewhere, because it was too bulky to be carried around with them. So out of the 50 kegs of silver, 49 were probably left in Danville or entrusted to somebody's care. We do not know exactly what happened because these men died and never told anyone what they had done about it. And somewhere, if you get out a metal detector in a graveyard or somewhere else in Danville, there may be a big pile of Mexican silver peso pieces.
After the departure from Danville, there is also no further reference made to the 16,000 English pounds sterling. Some historians believe that, like the Mexican silver, the English pounds are likely still buried somewhere in the area of the small Virginia town. The bizarre odyssey of Jefferson Davis's sad party continued as it moved first to Greensboro and then on to Charlotte, North Carolina. It was here that news arrived on April 26th that General Johnston had surrendered the last important Confederate army. Now all the Confederate leaders could hope for was to reconnect with their treasure and find some means of keeping it and themselves out of the hands of the all-conquering Yankees.
There's a chest in the library. Ever since I was a child, we were told that was where the Confederate gold was. It makes a real good story, and I like to believe that story.
Usually when you come into town, you're exposed to the Confederate gold.
It was ankle deep in gold and silver. That's just kind of how legends grow.
If I had to guess, I would bet there was still some gold out here someplace.
As I get closer to finding this treasure, as I get closer by putting the pieces of the puzzle together, I get more and more excited. And I know absolutely that I can put all the pieces together. It may not be today, it may not be next week or even next year, but I will solve the mystery. I will find it.
For Jefferson Davis, in April 1865, the trappings of being President of the Confederate States of America in Richmond had given way to steering a tired horse along muddy back roads through the Carolinas. By the middle of April, a full-scale manhunt was on to capture Davis and the gold. Union Secretary of War Stanton ordered troops to spare no effort and repeated the wild rumor that the rebel president was carrying between $6 and $13 million in gold. The Confederate treasure was only a fraction of this outrageous rumor, and most of that was not even with the Davis party. By the end of April, the gold from the Richmond banks had gotten as far south as Augusta, Georgia, but on arrival, no other Confederate officials would take responsibility for it. So Navy Captain William Parker, who was in charge of the treasure, decided the best decision he could make was to turn around and take the gold back to Jefferson Davis and let him worry about it. The Treasury Department gold, which was traveling with Davis through South Carolina, was disappearing fast as people left the group. To all but the president himself, it was clear that the end was fast approaching. Attorney General George Davis left the party in Charlotte. Treasury Secretary George Trenholm asked to be excused because of illness once the entourage crossed the border into South Carolina. Trenholm would later figure prominently in the legends surrounding the treasure. Secretary of State Benjamin and Secretary of the Navy Mallory both took a buggy and headed for the Florida border. Benjamin adopted the disguise of a French tourist, and Mallory that of his interpreter. As each cabinet member or other official left the Davis entourage, they were given money in $20 gold pieces.
Money was paid out to these people to get them home. People had not been paid, and the only money they had was Confederate money. So the money was filtering away, slowly being dissipated.
Amounts of gold were also being given out to returning soldiers, now being found all along the escape route. Constantly alert for federal patrols, Jefferson Davis and the sad remains of his government at last crossed the Savannah River and moved into Georgia. On May 3rd, after a hard day's ride from Abbeville, South Carolina, they approached the outskirts of the small town of Washington. This was prosperous cotton country before secession and had been spared any contact with the destruction of the war. Davis was sure he could count on being warmly welcomed by the town's loyal citizens.
The best account is that a lone man on horseback came into town on the road, the main road from Abbeville, which we would know today as Alexander Avenue and Court Street, and came up in front of the Bank of Georgia building, and the bank had ceased to function. The Robertsons were still living there. He had been the last cashier. That we know today is, we call it the Herd Building. Apparently some people were sitting on the porch, and this man came into town to check it out to see whether or not it was clear of Yankees. And Mrs. Robertson, when she found out who he was and what he was doing, invited the president to stay at her house.
If you were here when Jeff Davis came in, you would have found the Herd House standing there, the square not looking like it does now, and it would have been very congested. It was a big event. They probably knew this was it.
The exhausted Jefferson Davis greeted the crowd, then went into the Robertson home and collapsed into sleep. The Confederate treasure, or what was left of it, was now reunited in this Georgia town of Washington.
The two treasures that got here, the approximately $450,000 that belonged to the 8 Richmond banks, that stayed here for a while and was stored in bank vaults. The government treasury, I know before they got to Washington, a large number of troops were paid off, $26.25 or something like that, and they thought they had not been paid for a long time in the Army, that it was due them. They knew and thought they were getting what was theirs.
By now, the government treasury had been reduced from as much as $400,000 to just over $175,000, and even this would soon shrink. On May 4th, Jefferson Davis called a final meeting of his staff and remaining cabinet. He announced that he believed the time had sadly arrived when the government must be disbanded. When his staff concurred, the government of the Confederate States of America vanished into history.
Sitting here in the main square at Washington, Georgia, and looking at the site, which was also the site of the Bank of Georgia Washington branch, and the feeling I have was lost opportunities, what might have been. And I'm sure that must have been the very bitter fruits that President Davis thought of during that meeting. They start out with high hopes, control of 800,000 square miles of territory, 10 million people. And in less than 3 years of really active fighting, had gone down the drain.
As his last official act, Jefferson Davis asked a former Treasury official, Micaiah Clark, to take responsibility for what was left of the Treasury gold and the gold of the Richmond banks.
Micaiah Clark decided, I'm sure after conferring with President Davis, that the Treasury train was slowing down the retreating column, that Union cavalry was reported all over this area. And so Clark decided that he would take the Treasury train and move on to Florida.
But before moving the treasure, Micaiah Clark made a series of payments which would virtually exhaust what was left of the Treasury Department gold. Most of the cavalry escort was paid off. $40,000 went to other returning soldiers. $10,000 to Secretary of War Breckinridge. $2,000 to General Braxton Bragg. And finally, $35,000 would stay with President Davis's party. It was all that was left of a treasury that had once held millions. Jefferson Davis wrote one last letter to his wife Verena, describing his plans and the condition of the soldiers accompanying him.
They have become so much demoralized that I can no longer count on them. I have therefore determined to disband them and try to make my escape. We will cross the Mississippi and join General Kirby Smith, where we can carry on the war forever.
At approximately 10 a.m. on May 4th, Davis presented his Washington hostess with a few mementos. He bid farewell to a group of soldiers and waved to a crowd, then turned his horse south out of town and rode off toward a very uncertain future. Behind him, the $450,000 of Richmond Bank gold remained in a Washington, Georgia vault. What happened next to this treasure would start the legend which flourishes to this day.
Well, I did hear one time, said he thought so much gold left Washington here on a wagon.
My mother said she wouldn't mind getting one of the little metal detectors so that we could go around and try to find the gold.
I've had two people to come to me since then and say, I know where the treasure is. One of them said, for $500,000, I'll tell you where it is.
Everybody wants to know where the gold is. And nobody's gonna know. I don't know if we'll ever know where it is.
Jefferson Davis had left Washington, Georgia to continue his struggle to make it to Texas and find some way to breathe new life into his dream of a Confederacy. But to everyone else, capture seemed more and more certain. Before leaving Washington with President Davis, Treasurer Micaiah Clark had decided to risk one last chance at trying to get a large amount of the Treasury gold out of the country.
His last official act was to disperse $86,000 to one James Semple, who was another Navy officer.
Most historians agree that Semple had been told to hide this money in the false bottom of a wagon and to get it to the seaports of Charleston or Savannah. From there, it could be sent to Confederate sympathizers in Nassau, Bermuda, or Liverpool.
The $86,000, as far as I know, has never been accounted for.
Lee Spence thinks he knows where it is. He believes this part of the treasure found its way into the hands of one man, Secretary of the Confederate Treasury, George Trenholm.
George Trenholm, to the historians, was Treasurer of the Confederate States of America. What he was to me is he was a blockade runner.
Faced with a federal naval blockade of most of its ports, the Confederacy throughout the war struggled to obtain the supplies and material it needed to live, much less conduct a war. To stay alive, the South relied on blockade runners, sleek vessels which stood a chance to outrun northern warships and make it to neutral ports to trade cotton for desperately needed supplies. George Trenholm and his partner owned 60 blockade runners, the largest such fleet in the South. Their ships brought in everything from cloth to cannon, from British rifles to ladies' hats.
By dint of hard work and associating himself with John Fraser, a merchant banker in Charleston, he became undoubtedly probably the first or second wealthiest man in the South at the time of the Civil War.
Trenholm was one of the cabinet members who accompanied Jefferson Davis in the escape from Richmond. However, he was suffering from a painful illness and asked to be excused once the party entered his home state of South Carolina. Lee Spence has a different interpretation as to why Trenholm left Jefferson Davis.
History says he left it because he was ill and needed medical attention. I think he left the train not because of his medical problems. I'm convinced that George Trenholm argued with Jeff Davis, trying to convince Davis that the war was hopeless. There was no way the South could win.
Most historians believe Trenholm gradually made it to a home he owned in Columbia, South Carolina, where he was soon arrested by federal officials. But Spence believes Trenholm first moved to Abbeville, South Carolina, an hour north of Washington, Georgia. Here he met up with Semple, and the $86,000 in gold supposedly headed abroad. It is known that a large amount of the Confederate treasury had been loaned to the government by Trenholm and his firm. Spence believes that Semple was aware of this debt and willingly turned the gold over to Trenholm.
These men, when they got to Abbeville, met with Trenholm's son and turned over part of the gold or all of the gold at that time. George Trenholm arrived the next day and would have taken possession of it at that time. One of the locations that I believe he hid it at was the mill that we will be going to today. They have a canal feeding into
Lee and the rest of his team have arrived at an old textile mill once owned by George Trenholm.
Out of the building, but I don't know if they hid it in the building, you know, in the tunnels and the water there, or if it's actually in the stream bed here or up in the canal up above. In a minute.
Lee believes Trenholm hid a large cache of gold here by diverting the water from the mill's tunnels and streams, then burying the gold, and finally covering the clues to the treasure's location by once again diverting the water.
Somewhere in here, the Confederate gold is here, at least part of it. How much he hid here, I don't know. I don't know if he's hid one box here or if he hid 15 boxes here. The dreams that you had as a child at night, you would go to sleep and you would dream of finding treasure. Picture this in your dream. This is the perfect place for it.
Lee Spence will soon discover if dreams come true. He will see if a crumbling old mill holds the secret of the lost Confederate gold.
It always amused me if anyone wanted a ditch dug and didn't want to pay anybody for it, all they had to do was say, I heard once that there was possibly some Confederate gold in that area.
I believe it's out there. I believe there's a lot of it out there. I believe it's in a number of locations.
A few years ago, a man was at the Mirabilis Library and said he had his Geiger counter, a metal detector, and he was going out to where the gold robbery occurred, that his grandmother grew up near there and told him that whenever it rained, the gold would just wash up out of the ground.
Those probably had water in them instead of being meant for walking in. They probably had water.
While others might see this old mill as only a crumbling relic, Lee Spence believes the building hides the last traces of the lost Confederate gold. His theory is based on a number of letters written by Confederate Treasury Secretary George Trenholm from his prison cell after the war.
Look at the archway there. See the circle on the keystone?
But according to Spence, these letters didn't easily reveal their secret.
And I was reading some of Trenholm's letters from prison, and while I was reading them, they didn't make sense. And I started thinking, well, maybe they're veiled messages in here, but I had no proof of it. It seemed like he was talking in riddles and allegories. And then I came across a really strange letter, and it was about a mill diverting the water, and basically the wife in the story is saying, if we had our own mill, we could be rich. And then I came across another letter, and it was from one of his employees, where he's actually saying in there, if we use veiled messages, people won't know what we're talking about. And so finally, I was able, with those different letters, to realize they're definitely talking in veiled messages.
One thing is certain. The gold Lee seeks has not been seen in 133 years.
Let's see, if you'll grab this one, then I think I'm going to use this one right here. Okay, what we've got here is we have some underwater metal detectors. If I pass it over gold, it'll just about blow my ears out. I mean, it'll give a hell of a ring. Okay. You have no idea what this means to me, to be here at the mill. And if you don't think that's exciting, you have no concept of what it's like to research and to go after something this many years and actually put the pieces together, and it could be here, it could be today.
The search begins. As two of the men start diving in the stream, Lee and an assistant head into tunnels that reach under the old mill.
Watch out for the thorns here. Careful. At least this one's dry.
These tunnels once carried water to the mill's machinery. Lee thinks they may have been a perfect spot for hiding gold.
I don't know why this would be here. This looks out of place right here.
Yeah, I think it's moved to modern times. I'm getting hits everywhere.
We'll go ahead and ignore the small ones here. No, it's broken up. It's not what we're looking for.
This tunnel looks especially promising to Lee.
It was a little warmer out there.
But very cold water and a century of accumulated mud make walking difficult.
You have to be dedicated.
While Lee wades through the mud in the tunnels, two divers survey the stream bottom. If the treasure's here, it would likely be further back into the tunnel. But Lee won't get there today.
Man, I wish I had a little canoe to come back in here. That would be neat to come back in a little canoe and see how far it goes. I can't walk in here. I'm up to my crotch in mud. And I have not touched solid bottom. So this is really a good hiding spot. Just signals everywhere. Even today, it's hidden. See the gold sticking out there on the end? People have asked me why the gold would still be here. Why wasn't it dug up? George Trenholm was hiding it. Trenholm had to wait until the Reconstruction governor had been thrown out of power. The carpetbaggers were gone. George Trenholm died the week that the Reconstruction governor, the Yankee governor, was kicked out of South Carolina. He couldn't dig it up. He was dead. Sadly, the secret died with him.
This day's search has allowed Lee and the others to get a look at only a few of the possible hiding places at this location. But Lee is optimistic. Not everyone shares Lee Spence's belief that George Trenholm came into possession of a large portion of the Confederate treasure.
George Trenholm has been accused of taking some of the Confederate treasure. I think there's no grounds, in fact, for that. Also, we have to keep in mind that at this point, that George Trenholm was very ill, and that's why he left the government column in the first place.
People say he somehow or other got his hands on some of this money. The Richmond Bank gold is very well accounted for. He didn't get his hands on any of that. He might have known where the Mexican silver was and dug that up. Most George Trenholm would have gotten, probably as the retiring Secretary of the Treasury, was enough coin to get him to his home in Columbia, South Carolina.
But even the best informed skeptics do not dissuade Lee Spence from his conviction that Trenholm did hide the Confederate gold.
I believe that one day we will find the treasure, but it will actually be a letdown, because the fun, the thrill is the chase of it. It's going and looking for it, the excitement, the dream. I'm still a kid in my heart. This excites me. This is fun. I'd love to do this the rest of my life.
The old Chenault Cemetery is dangerous to walk in it because there's been so much digging. Whether they found any gold or not, we do not know.
I've never been actually in the cemetery, but I've heard that it's very difficult to walk in it because of the holes and the stones. The tombstones have been broken apart.
From what I have read, they even tried to drain that branch of the creek to find the gold. It never was found.
No one knows where the gold went, or where it is, or what happened to it.
And I'm sure if something would come out of this and we could point to it, we may have a whole lot of people in town with that shovel, including myself. I don't know, but it could be.
In early May 1865, the treasure which had left Richmond was divided between two locations. The $450,000 in Richmond bank gold sat in a vault in Washington, Georgia. Of the Treasury Department gold, only about $35,000 remained, and it was traveling south with Jefferson Davis. With him were 4 aides and the last 10 cavalrymen from his original escort of several thousand. He continued moving south through central Georgia. On the 7th, he finally caught up with Verena and the children, who had been traveling ahead of his party. Davis was now the subject of a massive manhunt by federal cavalry. A reward of $100,000 had been offered for his capture, and $25,000 for lesser Confederate officials. The Yankees searching for Davis were also inspired by rumors that the president was carrying with him $15 million in gold. In truth, the Davis party was traveling with no more than $35,000 of the hundreds of thousands in treasury gold with which it had started the journey. Captain Micaiah Clark now distributed some $10,000 in gold coin to Davis aides. Clark then left the president's party with a few of the cavalrymen and headed for the Florida border. With him was the remaining $25,000 in gold. Jefferson Davis himself carried only some worthless Confederate paper money and an English 50-pound note given him as a gift by a friend. On the night of May 10th, the Davis party camped in some woods near the South Georgia town of Irwinville. At dawn, Davis arose and opened his tent flap to find blue-coated soldiers in camp. The Yankees had found him at last. The Federals weren't quite sure of what they'd happened onto. Davis took advantage of the confusion and attempted to escape into the surrounding woods. In the darkness, he mistakenly grabbed his wife's rain cape, and she impulsively threw one of her shawls over his head. Northern newspapers would later unfairly brand him a coward for trying to escape in women's clothing. The president made it about 50 feet from the tent before a Union trooper galloped up and ordered him to halt. Jefferson Davis's desperate escape attempt and dreams of reestablishing the Confederacy were finally over. It had all lasted a mere 5 weeks.
So from the beginning in Richmond, with $500,000 estimated to carry on this war, and then the intent to do so, a little over a month later, he is penniless and on his way to prison.
Davis would spend 2 years in a federal prison, then live out his life with Verena on a Mississippi plantation. Through all the years after his odyssey with the treasure, Jefferson Davis and his wife struggled financially. To his death in 1889, he would defend the righteousness of the Southern cause he had so faithfully led. Captain Micaiah Clark and the last of the Treasury gold had managed to make it to Gainesville, Florida, when he heard of President Davis's arrest. Clark and the troops still with him debated what to do with the $25,000 they still had. Clark wanted to pay the men for their efforts and take the remainder to England to await further orders. The men, however, wanted to set aside 1/4 of the money for Verena Davis and the children, then split the remainder between themselves. Outnumbered and outvoted, Clark gave in. The money was divided, and the men went their separate ways. As far as we know, none of the money was ever sent to Mrs. Davis. The Confederate treasury, which had been carried south with such care and high hopes, had now totally vanished. But if the gold from the Confederate treasury had gradually disappeared, and virtually all of it is accounted for, why are tales of buried treasure still part of life in Washington, Georgia?
In my opinion, the stories about the Confederate gold being buried all over the South, I think, stemmed not from the Confederate treasury coming through this part of the South, but stemmed from what happened to the Richmond bank funds.
Federal troops occupied Washington, Georgia almost immediately after the departure of Jefferson Davis, and it wasn't long before they discovered the $450,000 in Richmond bank gold being stored in the city.
The federal troops rather quickly seized the gold and monies from the Virginia banks that was involved. That was known almost immediately to them, probably because it was known to everyone in the town.
The federal authorities in charge of Washington now granted the representatives of the banks their request to return the gold to Richmond.
We don't know what their thinking was from any recorded history, but we can guess that their thinking was that maybe things have settled down enough now that we can get the money back to Richmond and get it in the bank without it being robbed.
Their fears were not unreasonable. Washington and its surroundings had been in chaos. Bitter and penniless Confederate soldiers wandered the roads, desperate to find any means to get themselves back to their homes. On the other side, many Union troops, flush with victory, needed little encouragement to loot and steal at will. The wagons carrying the $450,000 in gold left Washington and headed north toward Richmond and the safety of the banks.
Right now, we are sitting on the spot where the gold train wound up on the evening of the 24th of May. The Chenault plantation, which was then owned by Reverend Dionysius Chenault, was about a day's ride from Washington. Chenault was contacted when the gold train arrived. He provided for them a horse pen, which was adjacent to this main house. And they set up the 5 wagons.
Shortly after the wagons had been placed for the night, a large group of former Confederate soldiers attacked without warning and quickly subdued the Yankees guarding the gold.
It was night, and there was a lot of frenzy involved in it. They spilled about $220,000 in the gold inside the wagons. $40,000 in gold was spilled outside the wagons, immediately surrounding the wagons. People would fill their saddlebags, put it on their horse, and actually 2 saddlebags of gold is about all a horse can carry. But some people would tie their trousers at the ankle and put as many coins in there as they could.
The raiders immediately took off with their plunder. Some were reportedly from as far away as Kentucky. Others were almost certainly from the local countryside. But both groups would likely have soon hidden their treasure for fear of being captured. Indeed, a search party was quickly organized, and over $140,000 was tracked down and recovered. But there remained a great deal of gold never found by the authorities.
Across the way, at nearby house of Fenton Matthews, his sons, Bob and John and Joe, while out the next morning hunting for cattle, came across a trail of gold coins, and finally went to a stump. In the stump, they found a sack of gold.
A lot of it was found in things like hollow trees and stumps and ditches and mud puddles, and was collected. People just stashed it. Some of it was probably stashed and people forgot about it. It may be still there.
There was one man that was rumored to have thrown a bag of gold into a creek and made it out west, and when he was dying, basically confessed that yes, he never made it back to get the gold.
Unfortunately, there was a sad epilogue to the raid. 2 months after the attack, former slaves of the Chenault family reported to the Yankee authorities in Washington that since the raid, the Chenaults had been displaying jewels and other signs of great wealth. The commander of the Washington region accepted the servant's tale without reservation.
He immediately headed out this way. The house was again searched, the grounds were again searched. This had already been done twice previously for them. They actually did find a small cache of gold, but that was actually Reverend Chenault's.
The Chenault men were taken from the house into the adjoining woods, where their arms were tied behind them and they were lifted into the air by their thumbs. Throughout the night, they were tortured in this way to find out where they had hidden the gold. The Chenaults could tell them nothing. They had had nothing to do with the gold raid and had been asleep at the time of the attack.
The women of the Chenault family were kept in the house. They were taken upstairs and actually strip searched by the servants. Following this ordeal, which I'm sure they never really got over, they did things settled back down for them, other than the fact that people probably were still coming onto their property looking for gold.
Washington, Georgia also survived the rigors of the war and went on to become the successful and pleasant town it is today. But the dispute continues over whether any of the Confederate gold still waits to be discovered.
I just don't believe there would be a tremendously large amount of gold at any one place left from this. As I say, there might be a little bits and pieces here, yonder, and there.
My own feeling is that those who buried that money surely went back and dug it up.
I would not recommend that you run out and buy a shovel or a pick.
I do believe there's gold somewhere, still waiting for somebody to find it.
None of the articles or books I've read can exactly pinpoint. They think it's there, but nobody knows what happens to that $100,000. And we think it's around here.
I can see treasure everywhere. I can see where it could be hidden. I'm like a child again.
It is claimed that the last cache of Confederate treasure was dug up long ago, but who can say for sure that the chaos and fear which clouded those final days of war did not also conceal at least a few bags of gold left behind in panicked flight? One thing is certain. It's impossible to visit this special place and not feel the presence of Jefferson Davis, the ghosts of defeated yet proud Confederate soldiers, or the golden treasure that failed to save their lost cause.
The Nürburgring is unlike any other racetrack in the world. It's unique. It's like a wide open country road that you just run as fast as you can. The Corvette team began coming to the Nürburgring several years ago, started testing with the C5, and then that rolled right into the C6. We usually come for a 2 or 3 week stay at a time, and we usually come once or twice a year, and we've been coming the last half dozen years. There are two things that make the Nürburgring fascinating. The first thing is just how difficult of a course it is to drive. Very high speed, very fast corners, lots of vertical motion. Second thing is the demands that it puts on the vehicle for tires, for shock absorbers, for cornering grip, and for power. It's very fast, very long circuit, need lots of horsepower. We're very pleased with how the Corvette performs at the Nürburgring. It does very well in the tight twisting corners. We have very good tires. We have a lot of roll stiffness, so we get a lot of cornering power with the Corvette. But on the fast sections, we have 400 horsepower, and we excel on the fast sections, also on the tight twisting sections. Corvette is very good all the way around. There are two places that the Corvette pulls extremely high G's during a corner. The first place is Fuchs Row, very fast section going down into a valley and turning, so the car has a lot of downforce as it's compressed into the valley. Second place is the Carousel, which is a very high banked corner on the Nürburgring. One of the great things about participating during industry pool time is you're out here with your competitors. And we have the opportunity to run them down for every corner, pass them on the straights. We can catch them in the corners, catch them on the straights, catch them even in the air. For years, American manufacturers did not come to the Nürburgring. Just the European manufacturers were here, and it was a great secret. And now we've found out about it, and we love it. We come here, there's a lot to learn. We make better cars by being at the Nürburgring with Corvette.